Then Aviva will be back, I think next week sometime, to talk a little bit about how she ended up doing her master's in ethics.
Yeah, so Dr. Paulus is coming for another session today? Yeah, perfect, okay. So, hi, some of you know me, most of you don't. I'm a pediatric nephrologist slash ethicist, so a nephrothicist, and I will talk to you a little bit more next week about why I chose that path. But today I wanted to talk to you about research ethics and really what you need to know. So there's a lot you need to know, not that we can get through all of it in an hour. And I just want to explain kind of the underpinnings of why when you go to the REB and you have to fill out all these forms and you get a letter back from them and you have to make changes and it goes back and forth a number of times and it's frustrating, why those rules exist. What are the reasons why those rules exist, and what are some of the things that we need to keep in mind while you're designing your research to make sure that it is ethical, why we kind of got to that as a society. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of research ethics, because I think really knowing that and understanding that a little bit more deeply really can help you through those nights when you're like, why did the REB make me do this? It can sort of emphasize to you why it's important, where we've come from and where we need to be. Some of the important elements of ethical research, and then we're going to do some case studies. So there's about 11 of you, so we have 3 case studies, and you can teach each other what the right thing to do is in these tricky research ethics situations. So those of you who went to med school here, I often use this same analogy when teaching medical students about the Navy diving suit. So the head of the Research Ethics Board, I think he's retired now, but when I was a resident, the head of the Research Ethics Board was Dr. Nick Antonison, who, aside from being an amazing doctor, was also a diver in the U.S. Navy in World War II. So if he's retired, it is a well-deserved retirement because he's been at this for a while. Anyway, he, when he was doing his Navy training, he tells this story about going down in the Navy diving suit and all these bells and whistles and knobs and stuff that were on the Navy diving suit. It didn't look like this. This is something from like the early 1900s. By the 1950s, it had gotten a little bit better. But he said, there's all these bells and whistles and stuff on the suit. Why is it? Generally in the Army or the Navy, you're not allowed to ask a lot of questions, but he did. And his supervisor said, sailor, for every knob on that suit, a sailor died before you. Meaning that there were safety things that happened. Somebody didn't have enough oxygen, or there was too much pressure, or whatever it was, and they died. And they learned from these mistakes, and they built in all sorts of safety stuff into the Navy diving suit so that people would be safer going forward. And so it got more and more complicated as the years went on, and the suits became more and more safe. Research ethics is a lot of the same. As we learn from the mistakes that we made, we go forward. So this is just a brief history. If you look back to the early 1800s, you have Thomas Percival, who said that it was important to treat research subjects ethically, that you couldn't just do something on somebody because you felt like it was the right thing to do. But it wasn't really codified until really the mid-20th century, so the mid-1900s. There was German research ethics, and this is in 1931, so before the rise of the Third Reich. And that was actually the first country that really codified what they thought about research ethics. They quickly threw that in the garbage and did terrible things to people, but it was the first country that really codified what they thought research ethics should compromise. But of course, it didn't last. So the Second World War, between the late 1930s, the Nazi medical experiments are well known for having experimented on people with did terrible things to people without their consent. There was a debate after World War II about whether some of the findings from this research should be used, because there were some findings on things like hypothermia and that sort of thing that people felt could actually inform future practice. In the end, it was generally decided that because the experiments were so horrendous and so horrible, and because you really couldn't trust the Nazis to have been honest in their dealings, that really couldn't be used for much else. And so the research, if we can put it in quotes from that time, has largely been thrown out. But it's not just the Nazi experiments that were problematic. There was a Nuremberg trials after World War II, where it actually had a special trial for doctors who were involved in the Holocaust and in the work that they did, and put these doctors on trial for what they did. And out of that came the Nuremberg Code of Ethics, the idea that we actually do have to have research ethics that we all agree to internationally that are important to do. But this wasn't the end of problems with research. there were several experiments. This is from the Fernald State School, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, where experiments were done on children who were institutionalized because they were a convenient sample and because their parents didn't have much other choice of where to put them. And the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more about how that's affected even the way people view medical research today. Here in Canada, we're not blameless. In northern Manitoba and other parts of northern Canada, Aboriginal children were experimented on with nutritional experiments well into the 1950s without any consent and without even knowing. So sometimes, for example, they'd do an experiment where they would take away vitamins that had been supplied to the community to see whether communities that didn't get the vitamins had higher rates of tooth decay than communities that had. And this was only brought to light about 5-6 years ago that this had been a major problem. So it was something that was our own university participated in and it has since apologized for. And then in 1964, the Helsinki Accords said, you know what, Nuremberg wasn't enough. We need to actually be a little bit more proactive in this and made more regulations regarding human ethics research. So Tuskegee. So I want to talk a little bit more about Tuskegee because I think it's a perfect example of how good intentions can go seriously wrong and that people who start out wanting to do an ethical thing can end up being very, 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 very unethical because they're pulled along. So who knows about Tuskegee? Can you tell me? Yeah.
So the study in Alabama, I think it started in the 40s. On the effects of syphilis, and I think in particular they were interested in tertiary syphilis. And the big thing that happened was penicillin came around and there was a cure, and they declined to provide I think they said that they gave the treatment to people, but then didn't and continued to study the effects of untreated syphilis.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good summary. So it started in the 1930s in the South, and it was started as a study to look at the natural history of syphilis in black men. So one of the reasons behind it was that there was a conception at the time that people of different races were fundamentally different. We know that certain diseases are more common in some groups than in others and that sort of thing, but that there was fundamental differences in the humanity of people from different races. And there were syphilis studies that had been done in a Nordic country, I can't remember if it was Norway or Sweden, anyway, where they looked at tertiary syphilis in the 1800s and followed it along. And so the researchers here were trying to prove that actually, no, we're more alike than we're different, and the way syphilis acts in white people is the way that it acts in black people. And one of the main researchers at the beginning was African American himself and was really trying to say, we need to treat African American people for diseases that affect them the same way we do white people. Started out with good intentions. However, penicillin came along and they were doing a natural history study, so following what happens to untreated disease. Now you have a treatment. And there were questions about whether funding would continue for this study if they just treated everybody for their disease, because that wasn't the initial intention. And they actually deliberately withheld treatment from black men with syphilis, even though it was commonly available after World War II, to the point where people who would have gotten the treatment had they not been in the study were actively denied it and were lied to, told that they were getting treatment when they were getting their investigational lumbar punctures and other things like that. Another problem with the Tuskegee study is that the researchers didn't say as they were going along, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what we're changing. It wasn't until the 1970s that it was discovered by, I think, journalists who were looking into the case and who said, hey, this is wrong and this shouldn't be going on. So it was a pretty much seen to be a huge ethical violation. So it was the 1970s. The ongoing problem with Tuskegee is not only was it a huge ethical violation at the time, but it affects the way that people see their healthcare now. So there was a study that was done in the States by a health economist looking at the differences in life expectancy between black and white men in Alabama in the 1970s to 1980s. And they were able to track this time, so the study started in the 1930s and it wasn't disclosed until 1972 what they were doing. And they saw that the life expectancy, the outpatient visits of black men relative to white men fell significantly after the Tuskegee trial was disclosed. So people found out about Tuskegee, they didn't trust the medical establishment, they didn't go to their doctors for their regular checkups. not only was that a problem, but then when they looked at their life expectancy in 1980, they were able to directly correlate back 1/3 of the difference in life expectancy between black and white men in that area at that time, back to the fact that this trial happened and that it was disclosed and that people didn't trust the medical system. So 1/3 of the difference was not because of higher rates of diabetes in that population, higher rates of heart disease, but because they didn't trust the medical system. So it's a problem not only when you do unethical research for the people in that study, but for everybody around who now is suffering the consequences of that, and people trying to do the right thing and trying to do ethical research who now can't build trust with their research subjects because of these things that have been going on. And if you ask people now, there was just a study that came out a while ago that one of the biggest barriers to people's participation in medical research is that they don't trust the investigators. And that is more of a problem in marginalized populations than it is in typically privileged populations. So because of trials like Tuskegee and other trials like that, Canada has a very elaborate system of research ethics that requires approval. So if you're a place that's going to accept federal funding for research, which pretty much any university or medical school is, you have to adhere to the Tri-Council policy statement. It's Tri-Council because it involves 3 groups: the previous Medical Research Council, NSERC, the National Science and Engineering Research Council, and SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities. Most of what you're going to be doing is probably under stuff that would be under the Medical Research Council type of umbrella, but sometimes social science research too is something that you would be doing. So they all have to follow the same rules. So even if you're doing, let's say you're doing a study looking at oral histories of people, you can't just go and take their oral history and do whatever you want with it. You have to actually adhere to research ethics guidelines. They're different based on whether it's an interventional study or an oral history, but they're there. If you want to keep getting funding into the university, you have to be in compliance, so that's why we have a research ethics board at our university, and there's 2 components of it here, one that's for more clinical research and one that's for more survey or sociological or anthropological research within the health sciences. So there's 2 here at the Bannatyne campus. And they keep updating it and changing it and that sort of thing, but you have to adhere to it. And that's what the Research Ethics Board is looking at when they're reviewing your proposal. The guiding principles are things that, to us in 2017, seem like, oh yeah, of course we should be doing this. We should be maintaining human dignity, getting free and informed consent, protecting vulnerable people, protecting privacy, including people and being just, and balancing harm and benefits. And we're going to go into all of these in a little bit more. But what I want you to remember is these are very hard-won values. We didn't always believe that these were important things in research ethics. It's only now that we've made a lot of mistakes along the way that we realize how important they are. So summary-wise, I want you to understand that the research standards have evolved significantly. This is something that, okay, none of us were alive in 1935, I don't think. Yeah, probably not, no. If you are, I want to hear your moisturizer strategy. But we know people who were alive then, right? Like this is within our collective history as a people to understand that this is something that's pretty new. And we need careful ethics oversight to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again. So let's go into a little bit more about what ethics research review is and why the REB looks at different things, why there are those different parts on the forms you have to fill out. So the number one thing is this idea of respect for human dignity. If you're doing research that is an affront to human dignity, you're not going to be allowed to do it. So unethical research is not allowed, but also poor research that's really not going to achieve its intended goal. The Research Ethics Board will often come back and say, I don't think you should be doing this research because it's not going to get the answer that you're looking for. You're going to be putting people through a process that's not going to achieve its intended goal. So when the Research Ethics Board comes back with scientific questions about your study, it's because they want to make sure that the ethics is that the science is there so that human dignity can be maintained, that we can be doing good research for good reasons. In clinical ethics, you know this, we have autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence, and those don't apply in the same way to research as they do to clinical. So we think in kind of similar ways, but these are ethics principles related to how we practice as clinicians, but not to how we do research. In research, we have kind of different goals. We have the idea that we have to have free and informed consent, we have to have privacy and confidentiality, we need to think about inclusion, and we have to avoid conflicts of interest. So what do I mean by all those things? Okay, so consent. You'll remember this from clinical ethics, that if you're going to do something to somebody, biopsy them, do surgery on them or whatever, you have to get informed consent. And that involves not only what they do, saying yes or no, but also what we provide to them. That we have to give them enough adequate information that they can make a good decision. They have to be voluntary, and they have to have capacity or competence, depending on what the kind of research is that we're talking about, to make that decision. Capacity meaning that they can make sort of a choice within a wide range of choices, and it's sort of like a dimmer switch. Competence being a legal determination of yes or no. You either are or not competent. In pediatrics, we often have people who are not competent by legal definition, but often do have capacity. So we wouldn't, for example, do a research study on a 12-year-old without involving them in the process, without getting their assent to be in that process. Their parents still have to be the ones to make the ultimate decision, but really for ages 7 and above, the Research Ethics Board requires you to involve the patient in the decision making in some sort of way, and usually talking to them and having a written form that explains what the research is about. So what can be some of the problems with getting consent, informed consent in research? What do you see as being some of the barriers to doing good informed consent in pediatric research?
I think in pediatrics in particular, there's a lot of times where we've done things for years, but historically the research hasn't been done in that population. So then when you're doing informed consent about a new procedure and how it compares or doesn't, the way we can talk about that is be thorough or accurate as when we're talking about adults.
Yeah, so a lot of what we do in pediatrics isn't as evidence-based as what's done in adults, and so it can be difficult to have that discussion when we don't have good evidence for our standard of care, for example. That's a really good point.
In some cases, we don't know or we can't predict what the long-term risks are going to be. So we can say your child doesn't have an immediate risk of this or that, but as an adult, we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that often comes up in vaccine trials, right? Like we think this vaccine will be good. This is what we think it'll do, but we don't have 40 years of data to say this is what's going to happen to you when you're 60 years old after you've had this vaccine. Yeah, we don't have that long-term data a lot of the time.
With kiddos, comparatively to adults, you have multiple people making the decision. While one person's signing the form, it's a family process, and even with the kids who are 12, for example, if they say they don't really want to do it, in theory they shouldn't be involved in the study, but they're not the formal ones consenting, they're assenting, and so there's all the politics around what that looks like and means.
Yeah, excellent. So, and usually parents are going to be on the same page, but what if they're divorced? What if they disagree? What if it's a child in care? What if it's a child who's street youth and really doesn't have anybody taking care of them? How do we do that? So,
I think it's too people are just more cautious, and I know in the melatonin study that we looked at for the journal clubs that we did, they lost 20 people to just withdrawing consent halfway through, because they basically, most of them had talked to other people and then decided they didn't want their kid in the study, even though they had informed consent process initially implemented. So people are understandably more cautious in kids, and with good reason, but is that a barrier to actually getting people involved in meaningful research? And we do often say for things that happen in both adults and kids, if it's an interventional study, for example, we should have the adult data before we go down to kids, but sometimes we don't, right? There are some tumors or other diseases that only happen in pediatrics, so we don't necessarily have that same kind of adults we can try things out on before we try to bring it down to the kids level. Good. So there can be lots of issues with consent. This is the letter from the Tuskegee study that was their consent letter. I'm going to read it to you because it can be a little bit hard to read. Okay, so this is from the Alabama State Board of Health and U.S. Public Health Service. Dear Sir, some time ago you were given a thorough examination, and since that time we hope you have gotten a great deal of treatment for bad blood. You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished you will be given a special treatment if it is believed you are in a condition to stand it. If you want this special treatment, you must meet the nurse at blank at blank. She'll bring you to the Tuskegee Institute Hospital for this free treatment.
We will be very busy when these examinations and treatments are being given, and we will have lots of people to wait on. You will remember that you had to wait for some time when you had your last good examination, and we wish to let you know that because we expect it to be busy, it may be necessary for you to remain in hospital over one night. If this is necessary, you will be furnished your meals and a bed, as well as the examination and treatment without cost. Remember, this is your last chance for special free treatment. Be sure to meet the nurse. So what are the problems with this consent form?
Sounds like a car dealership.
Yeah. The car dealership, yeah, like you expect to see one of those like guys outside, yeah. Okay, it's like they're selling you something. You get the feeling that you're being sold a bill of sale. Yeah, there's something's going on beneath the surface.
It's not transparent at all.
It's not transparent at all. What are they actually going to do?
Not there anywhere.
Yeah, syphilis. Now, to be fair, syphilis was commonly known as bad blood in Alabama at the time. But you think if you're a medical researcher, you may say, you might know it as bad blood. We call it syphilis, and this is why. That would be important, right?
What the treatment is.
What the treatment is.
Yeah.
In fact, they were going to do lumbar punctures on these men to figure out whether they had tertiary syphilis. They weren't giving them any treatment. They weren't giving them penicillin. They were actually going to do lumbar. This special treatment was a lumbar puncture. Yeah.
There's no like indication like what will happen if you don't come. Like the researchers would have known that if they like didn't get treated, that like you could have like negative outcomes. But this is just for like you better come now.
Better come now, yeah.
There's like brain kind of.
What the risks of the treatment are, assuming it's an LP.
Right, you do LPs on kids now as residents. Like you tell people these are the potential risks of this procedure, right? It's not a minimal risk procedure. And it's certainly not a treatment.
There's like no contact information either. Like, should you have questions about what's going to happen? It's just like, meet this nurse and she'll take you there.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
And it's this is maybe lower on the list of things because I've identified. It's very like researcher driven or like focused on like, we're going to be busy and this is going to happen and we better come at this like very paternalistic.
Well, kind of putting people in their place, right? Like these are already people who are very underprivileged compared to the doctors in white coats that they're going to see. And this letter just serves to say, know your place. When you show up, don't expect to be taken care of because we're really busy. Like I'm a doctor. That's not very respectful of who they are and what they're bringing.
It's interesting to put them on that front because I think depending on how you read it, like either way it's wrong, so I would just say I preface that.
Yeah.
I mean, I could also see someone writing that thinking, well, they're making the person feel that they're important for being invited to participate. And, which still
possibly,
is absolutely wrong. But either way, it's,
no, for sure.
A game in language, right? Like you, lucky soul, we already have so many people here. But it's still very.
Yeah.
But there's also no like, what's the background behind this, and also what happens at the end. So if this is something good or bad, what does that mean, and what will you do, and how will we know?
Yeah, and to be fair, like we're looking at it with 2017 eyes, and there were some rules that were definitely different at that time. It was still in evolution, right? In terms of what was going to be, what was like the part about, how you, nowadays, for example, we have to disclose what happens if you're damaged in a research trial. That has to be in the consent letter. That probably wasn't a part of consent at that time. But certainly the rules even at that time were better than this. Very jargony too and reading level, like, we say nowadays we have to write at a grade 5 or 6 level for consent forms. The rates of literacy in this group at that time were for sure no better than 5 or 6, and maybe even worse. So that might have also been something. So overall, this is not something that would pass muster, of course, today. And that's why consent forms today are more complicated, because there's a lot more that we need to get in order to be ethical. Is there? This is from the Willowbrook study. So the Willowbrook study was one of a couple of state school studies. In this state school study, at the time in the 1950s, people who had children with developmental disabilities didn't have a lot of options. You could either keep your kid at home, but then you wouldn't have access to a lot of resources to help them. It could be very difficult. Or you could put them in one of these state schools. Nowadays we have a lot of resources to help people keep their developmentally disabled kids at home, PT, OT, supports at schools, that sort of thing. None of that existed. So it was either suffer at home alone without a lot of guidance, or put your kid in a state school that was a residential school where their physical needs would be taken care of and there might be some education as well. So Willowbrook, they decided, because they were seeing a lot of hepatitis in these populations because of overcrowding and the way that kids were housed together, they decided to do a study looking at hepatitis transmission. There was a ward of the school that hadn't been opened yet, and they were going to open it up. And the only way to get into this ward was to be part of this study, because they wanted to kind of keep it a clean environment where they were going to admit kids who did not have hepatitis and then purposely infect them with hepatitis A to study how it spread throughout the ward. So this was the letter that parents got. Dear blank, we're studying the possibility of preventing epidemics of hepatitis on a new principle. Virus is introduced in gamma globulin given later to some so that either no attack or only a mild attack of hepatitis is expected to follow. This may give the children immunity against this disease for life. We should like to give your child this new form of prevention with the hope that it will afford protection. Permission form is enclosed for your consideration. If you wish to have your child given the benefits of this new preventative, will you so signify by signing the forms? Does that sound like it should pass muster? Again, 1958. My parents were born by then. It's within my family's lifetime. What's the problems with this one?
It doesn't say what happens to the kids who don't get the...
Right, yeah. So kids who are infected with hepatitis and don't get into the treatment group, what happens to them?
It's like the word of it really like it puts a very positive light on this.
Yeah.
Very subtly like it's a good thing, you should do it.
Yeah, we're going to figure out what causes hepatitis, and some people will be immune, so that's a good thing.
What does that mean? A new principle, it's like a new principle, somewhat with when benefits are deadly.
And like the fact that they're giving kids hepatitis is only just mentioned as virus is introduced.
Right.
Like that sounds different than...
So do you remember how hepatitis A is spread? Fecal oral? So how are they introduced, like if you were told that you're right, they're going to use fecal, I mean, I don't know exactly how they were going to do it, but it's something that you think you should know, right? And the other thing is this was the only way to get into the school, was to agree to go into this study. So when we talk about voluntariness, they had no voluntariness, right? Like these people were desperate trying to get their kids into a place where they could get taken care of, and the only way to do it is to allow them to be infected with hepatitis. So voluntariness is not really a part of it. So that's concerning. Is there a downside to complicated consent forms? Because we do have some very complicated consent forms now. So what do you see? Yeah. So this is not understandable because it's too brief and too high level, but they would run the other being missing the forest for the trees kind of thing, or missing the trees for, you know what I mean. You don't know the important details because there's so much in there.
And sometimes they don't even read it when you give them a package and they say it's all just like,
Whatever.
Especially for simple things, like for like surveys and stuff like that, sometimes the consents are still really long.
Yeah. Well, and there's been research into this. So if you are a parent whose child had cancer and you're told on Monday night that your child has leukemia, worst day of your life, and then you're given a consent form for Children's Oncology Group study, which are excellent studies, extremely well done. 85% of kids with cancer end up in one of these Children's Oncology Group studies. And having been on the Research Ethics Board, the consents are somewhere between 25 and 35 pages on average, I would say. How much does a parent who's just been dealt this diagnosis understand that form or care? The doctors are saying to you, this is a study, we think it'll be good for your kid. 85% of kids with cancer are enrolled in studies. Will you do it? You might read through it. It depends. And I've certainly had like engineer parents and stuff who read through it with a fine-tooth comb and want to know everything. But a lot of parents are going to say, this is what the doctor wants. This is what we're going to do. And they're fine with that decision. Like they don't feel like they've been tricked or coerced in any way. They're just like, look, this is part of the package that comes with cancer. That's fine with me. If there's any chance I can help my kid, or even a kid like my kid, something I want to do. So there's some evidence that informed consent is done, and it's good for us because we've checked all our T's and dotted all our I's, but sometimes parents really don't care so much, and it can be overwhelming to have a form that's too long too, right? So it's all kind of a balance there, yeah.
I feel like too, when you have a long consent, if it's not something like your child has cancer, or this is something that's being added to the care and not taking away anything, like often it's a way to just, for a parent to easily say no to, is it's like, I don't have time to go through all of that. What you're describing to me isn't very clear. And what is, like, what are we actually getting? You're not even guaranteeing that my child will benefit. It's just not.
Yeah, so it can be hard to get that yes, with kind of a complicated form that really doesn't give them what they need to know in the way that they need to know it. So consent forms are good. They always have to be accompanied by somebody who's skilled in explaining the research too. So you don't want to just dump a form on somebody and say, sign this and let us know what you want to do. Standard of care. So you'd mentioned this, Suzanne, when you talked about the idea that we don't always have good evidence for our standard of care. But ethical research does need to be compared to something. So you may say, for example, like a placebo-controlled trial is going to give you the ultimate answer, and it's going to have the least number of patients to show a significant difference, and the biostats around that will show that it's maybe the purest kind of study. But we can't do placebo-controlled trials all the time because we do have a standard of care. So we couldn't say, for example, to the parent with leukemia, we're going to do this brand new treatment versus no treatment. That's not ethical, and we all see on the face why that would be the case. How can that be problematic, though? Sometimes we don't have evidence for what the standard of care is. Sometimes, too, the standard of care is so well ingrained into what we do that it seems like blasphemy to even consider doing something that would be different. And when we do the case examples, I'm going to get you guys to think about how you might deal with that. Again, Tuskegee, one of the major problems is at the time it was first thought of, there wasn't good treatment. But when the standard of care changed, the research should have changed, and it did not. And so that was one of the major problems with the Tuskegee trial, is that it didn't change along with the standard of care because it was such a long study, part of the reason. Okay, what about privacy and confidentiality? So confidentiality is an essential component to research, and research needs to be careful to include proper methods for collection and storage of research data. So what are some proper methods versus potentially improper methods? What things would pass muster with the REB?
Some things need to be made anonymous if possible and be identified, and then like stored in a certain locked area.
Double lock.
Yeah. And this is where the eye rolling starts, because people are like, oh, of course I'm going to do it ethically. Like, why would I, of course I'm going to keep it in a locked door. Of course I'm going to keep it in a password protected computer. Why is the Research Ethics Board so hyped up about that? Because, right, mistakes happen, right? There was a case a little while ago where a medical student was doing research with a gastroenterologist and had a computer that was stolen that had information on it that was maybe not encrypted properly. And you're like, whatever, it's just a GI study, who really cares? They know that I'm on a study of this PPI or whatever. But of course, people have a right to their information, whether we feel that it's really sensitive or not. They have a right to it, and sometimes we do really, really sensitive research, right? So this is Russell Ogden, and his example is one to learn from. So Russell Ogden, now he is still well known in academic circles, and he's a bit of a pariah. He does a lot of research in assisted dying and watching people die who have gone under assisted dying. This was well before it was legal in Canada, and he would go and see people committing suicide and do research with their consent on that. Anyway, as part of his master's thesis, which is at Simon Fraser University, he was doing a thesis on assisted suicides amongst people with HIV and AIDS. And his proposal was approved by the Research Ethics Board, and because both issues were very sensitive. Obviously, a lot of people with HIV/AIDS, especially at the time, this was in the 90s, early 90s, didn't want their status to be known because it's a very stigmatizing disease, especially at that time. And assisted suicide is illegal, and so people didn't want to have it known that they had done something illegal or had their friends and family member participate. So he said it was really important to say, you've got confidentiality. And the Research Ethics Board of his institution said, yes, you're right, you have to give them confidentiality. So at some point, one of his subjects had committed suicide, and he was subpoenaed to appear in front of the coroner's court to talk about what he saw. And he said, well, no, I said I would give them confidentiality, and I'm not going to talk about this. SFU, unfortunately, kind of hung him out to dry. he won his case, but SFU was not helping him with lawyer fees and was basically saying, well, he's a rogue researcher, he needs to take care of it himself, and we're not protecting him even though they'd approved his study. Now there's a lot more protection, especially for students, providing you legal protection if you are in a case like that where you do a controversial study, you follow all the rules, and you're still end up in some sort of legal case that the university needs to protect you, but that didn't exist at the time. Now, since that time, Russell Ogden's done other things where people feel like and I don't know the details, but some people feel that he's very ethical and other people feel that he's not. But at the time, his case was clear that he was doing something that had been approved, he was following the rules, and he shouldn't have been forced to tell stuff about his research in front of the coroner's court, but SFU didn't support him. So it's important to keep that confidentiality. This is obviously an extreme situation with a very stigmatizing procedure and disease, but in general, the rules hold true. So obviously things like name, date of birth, social insurance number are identifying. But those numbers that people can trace back to an individual are identifying. But sometimes even the disease is identifying. And I always use the example in pediatric nephrology of cystinosis, where we have like 6 people in the province who have this disease, and only one of them is a man. So if I were to do even a case report about this man with cystinosis, treated at Winnipeg Children's Hospital, it would be very clear to anybody who knew him who that was. It doesn't mean that I can't do it, but I need to get his permission and explain that this, for example, would be a case where he would be identifiable by his disease, as opposed to other things that we would never publish, like their name or social insurance number. So you have to kind of think about, especially with rare pediatric things, is this potentially identifiable? And even when you're submitting a case report or a case series, often journals will now want to know that you have the permission of the people that you're talking about, even if it's all de-identified.
Someone once said I've never considered it too, is not just for like someone to learn about you, but also it can affect your insurance forevermore. It can affect so if the wrong people were to look for that information, it's not just your own.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's a good point too, right? Like they look it up and they can trace it back to you. Will that have implications for things like employment, like in a Gattaca-esque future where we're all judged based on how healthy we are? Is that going to be problematic, right? Then there's this idea of vulnerable population. So when you think of a vulnerable population, who are you thinking about? What kind of person comes to mind? Minors. Children with disabilities.
Taken advantage of for their socioeconomic status or from discrimination in previous research.
So historically disadvantaged people, socioeconomically disadvantaged people. Yeah. Why might it be important to include such people in research?
They're part of the population.
Yeah, they're part of the population.
And they're often underrepresented.
Yeah, they're often underrepresented, right? So often, to err on the side of caution, for example, women have been considered a vulnerable population for many years because we own equipment that could create other human beings, and that equipment could, obviously if you expose a pregnant woman, for example, to a teratogenic medication, terrible things can happen to that fetus, to that baby, and that wants to be avoided. So because of that, often women of childbearing age, so anyone from menarche to menopause, were often excluded from a lot of research because there was this fear of teratogenicity. Not to underestimate, there's been terrible stuff that has happened when teratogenic medications have been provided, but women were then excluded from research that could potentially be beneficial. So now we know, for example, that a lot of psychiatric medications, the dosing should be different between men and women, but women were not part of the first trials that looked at these medications. That there may be the women's health research, for example, has been underfunded and under-researched because it was not felt to be of the same societal value as research on men that could potentially affect both men and women. So it's important to include these groups in research, but it's also important to protect them. And you could argue that there's a difference. There's a difference between women who, although we own baby-making equipment, can also have brains that can make decisions about whether we want to be included in research or not, and children or people with developmental disabilities who cannot make those decisions for themselves, right? Often it's been lumped together. Vulnerable people, including everybody who is not who's not an adult male. And of course there's differences within that you have to treat research involving women with childbearing potential differently than research with men, because you have to consider the teratogenicity, but it doesn't mean that people can't consent to that type of research. Research on children, research on people with disabilities, you have to understand who's making the decision for those people, how do we include those people as much as we possibly can in the research decision, and how do we do that? So vulnerable people has been kind of a clumped phrase and really needs to be divided. In Manitoba, of course, we have a very high population of Indigenous people who have had, as we talked about, very negative research interactions in the past. Another vulnerable group of people in some ways, but again, the group of people who can make adult people within that group who can make their own decisions, and how do we do that? So one of the things we've done, for example, with Indigenous populations is make very clear that we're not going to do research on Indigenous people without their inclusion as partners in that research. So we can't just subject people to research, we actually have to include them in the research. In designing the research, in figuring out what's important to their communities. So, for example, if you have a research involving Indigenous people, you have to actually go through a special committee of chiefs or representatives from the chiefs to say, this is what I want to do and this is why. And they'll often say, well, have you gone to the community you're talking about and engaged with them as a partner in that, making sure that this is research that they want done on their communities. And sometimes people say, well, that actually has stymied me from doing something that I think is important. And other times people are like, you know what, I never even thought about how this question would affect this community because I'm not part of that community. And that patient partnership really made it, or community partnership made it something better than it would have been had I just come in as a savior thinking that I know the right kind of research to do and I know the right, I know how to do it. So those engagements, that's happening with all groups, but especially with vulnerable populations to ensure that we don't recreate the mistakes of the past. This really came out of this idea of inclusion in research came out of the AIDS epidemic where at that time, to get access to antiretroviral therapies in the early years, you had to be part of a research trial. And so people affected by HIV and AIDS said, we need more research, we need to be part of this research, we need to be included in research. You can't just say, I'm not going to do this research because of homophobia or because I don't really care about this. That this needs to be something that's a very important part of research priorities for the entire country because people are dying from this disease. And really that protest was at the forefront of saying inclusion in research is something that's super important. We can't do research that we think is important. We have to do the research that society thinks is important. Okay, protecting people. So one of the things that you're going to look at in research is there's different kind of trials, right? You can do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and at different phases in these trials, what you're doing to people is going to be of more or less benefit to them. So for example, in phase 1 trials, you're really testing really untested medications on people, and you're more looking at safety rather than efficacy. So you're not saying to them, I think this is going to help you, but you're saying to them, this might one day in the future affect people like you, but really we're at such an early stage, we just need to figure out how much of this we can give to somebody to be safe, and we want you to be part of that. And that's okay as long as they know what stage they're at. If you're saying to somebody, we really think this is going to help you, and it's not going to have any possibility of helping them, you need to be honest about that. Sometimes people don't necessarily understand that, so phase 1 trials are often done kind of as last-ditch efforts in cancer treatment, for example, and people feel like it's their 1 in a million chance. It is, but they need to understand that the reason we're doing this trial is because nothing else has worked in them and we don't have anything else to offer, so now we're using them more as subjects for research than as actual curative types of treatment. And that needs to be very clear to people who are participating, especially in early phases. Sometimes we have to do phase 1 research in kids for some of these diseases that just don't happen in adults, some types of cancers and that sort of thing. And that can be a very difficult discussion to have with a parent. Like, we actually don't have anything that's going to help your kid, but maybe 10, 15 years from now, this medication can help the next family with neuroblastoma. Do you want to be a part of it? And for some parents, they really do. And they feel like it's leaving a legacy. Going back to that idea of bad science equals bad ethics, I often hear from people, why does the Research Ethics Board care about my sample size? That's not what they're supposed to be looking at, but they are, right? If your sample size is woefully inadequate to answer the question you have, then enrolling anybody in that study is bad ethics because you're not going to get to the answer. So often they will be very picky about the scientific details because they want the science to be better so that the ethics is better. Scientific integrity. This is an increasing problem with research as we have lots of pressures to publish and to produce. So you guys have to do a research project as part of your residency or part of this. If I am a protected clinician scientist, I have to produce I'm going to be judged by, how many papers did I publish, what kind of grants did I get, that sort of thing. And it all builds on your previous work, right? So if you've published a lot of papers, you're going to look better to the grant people and that sort of thing. This pressure, this outside pressure to produce and produce and produce can influence people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and scientific integrity can suffer. So if you look at Retraction Watch or those other websites that watch out for things that have been retracted from journals, people will make honest mistakes sometimes, but dishonest mistakes sometimes too, where they will publish false research or do lots of things to their data to kind of mold it so their statistics tell the story that they want to tell, that sort of thing. And we can all think of a million examples of that with long-reaching consequences, like the Wakefield trial that looked at vaccines, looked at gut inflammation with vaccines and convinced a generation of parents to not vaccinate their children, extended beyond that study, which only involved 12 kids. Lots of different things can impact on scientific integrity. If you're reviewing things for papers or for the research ethics board and you think, so I, for example, get a lot of transplant ethics papers to review, and sometimes I think, oh, wow, that was a good idea. I should have thought of that. I should have written that paper. Well, I can't really now because I now have confidential information that I am reviewing, so that would be unethical for me to sort of take ideas from there and then have them influence my own research until it's published, and then it's fair game, of course. Statistics, right, like lies, and statistics. You can make your graph look however you want it to look to get across the point you want. Falsifying data, omitting data. People have done all of these things. I know none of you would because you're all going to be pediatricians and so you're honest, but other people have done these things. And then salami slicing, having the same study that you kind of slice into 3 or 4 different things that you can publish in 4 different ways, so you get 4 publications out of it where you otherwise would only have had 1. None of those are considered good. Conflict of interest. So clearly if I'm being paid by a drug company to conduct this trial, that's a conflict of interest that I need to disclose. Doesn't mean that I can't do the trial. A lot of drug-funded research is very good and would only be affordable if we have the pharmaceutical companies on board to help us do that research. But where does conflicts of interest, what kind of other conflicts of interest can you think about other than being directly paid to do a study by a drug company? How does it impact on my career?
Getting someone access to other things by being part of the study, so getting access to other services that maybe they should be getting anyway.
Yeah, you can the school one that I talked about. The only way you can get your kid in is to be part of the study. The only way you can get access to antiretrovirals is to be part of a research study. I mean, that is sometimes the reality before these drugs are approved, but then we should be working on ways to get better access after that to make sure that people are involved.
So you're studying something like enroll a family member, conflict.
Yeah, a family member or even a patient, right? So in pediatrics and our subspecialties, we're often not very, there's only 5 pediatric nephrologists. If Dr. Dart, my colleague, wants to do a study, she's by necessity going to have some of her own patients in that study. She can't have it completely separate from her own patients, but maybe somebody else should be getting that consent, not her, sort of thing, so her patients don't feel influenced. So we all have some conflicts of interest. We need to disclose them. We need to always be reevaluating them and be aware of them. Okay, so I have 3 case series. We have about 15 minutes, so I'm just going to roughly divide you up. You guys will be 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so Linda, and you'll be part of group 1. It doesn't really matter, you can go with it. Okay, so group 1, you're going to be trying to figure out a gene that causes a rare type of pediatric movement disorder. From family trees, you just suspect the disease is autosomal recessive in nature, meaning both parents have to be carriers. You design a study to test parents, affected children, and their unaffected siblings to find the gene. Your analysis reveals that the disease is probably autosomal recessive. Almost all the families have 2 carrier parents and an affected homozygous child, but in one family the pattern doesn't fit. The mother is a carrier, the child is homozygous, but the father does not carry the suspected gene. What is going on, and what are you going to do as researchers? Okay, so that's case 1. Case 2, you guys are studying a new medication for severe psoriasis, which is a disfiguring disease which sufferers will do almost anything to relieve. This is in pediatrics. The new medication seems promising, but animal trials suggest it's teratogenic, so women should not take it when they are pregnant. How are you going to design your trial given the teratogenic risk? And because you're pediatricians, should teenagers be allowed to participate in this trial? How are you going to deal with confidentiality around that? Okay, so you guys are the psoriasis group. And group 3, you guys are working with children who are incarcerated at the Manitoba Youth Center. So where I threaten to send my children every time they do something wrong, but really, I hope they never end up there. Anyway, these are children who are incarcerated, teenagers. A lot of kids that you see there, you do a clinic there and you see that they seem depressed and come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And you want to do some research. You want to do some research to see what the frequency of depression is in this group and possible contributing factors so that you can help. How are you going to design a trial that's going to be ethical involving an incarcerated pediatric population? And how are you going to design it to protect confidentiality of people who are incarcerated and often under the care of Child and Family Services? So maybe spend about 10 minutes working on that, and the last 5 minutes we'll talk about what you discovered. How are you going to do ethical research?
Someone who is well, obviously younger than 18, probably in some cases, and doesn't have a sort of a guardian necessarily.
Yeah, I don't feel like it's more like if you are a pediatrician who's running this difficult
like most genetics, when they do genetics, things like those.
I was not sure if they were going to die involved because that increases the they're like, they're incarcerated and like they identify as like having a special status within the population. You don't want them to be like targeted for whatever reason.
And then also involving them in a way that actually get common for them to be like, or study. How do you make that?
It could be.
Yeah.
Decide whether
You think it's not as successful and really
You are like seeing it on a clinical basis and like identifying like how common this is and like what interventions have been and like it's like potentially practice-changing. You do a lot of government. In this case, you're just like a little bit too close to the population. To like contact the like one of your psychiatric colleagues is more like the problem with so you could be the person who like
when you figure out, like if it's someone has like autism or they
based on my clinical unfortunately to like see like if you're depressed or not. You would fit the criteria to be studied that right.
research
but that's the tricky part. It's like even small things will count as specific types of
Especially in like a prison population too, right? Where activities are so restricted. that they do like $10 credit at the commissary. And that,
Usually that rare.
is that,
Yeah.
yeah.
To that.
But I also don't think you should be using that, like, that to me seems to be more.
Yeah.
You only get access to yeah, so like,
Yeah, whereas the thing like, research is like, if the research used to be like, okay, we need to have a psychotherapist in the prison population, but like, you couldn't do it to be like the research is like, is this like a problem that like we need more research or not, like, is this intervention gonna work? So these people.
Yeah. Yeah, like it would need to be more like
So do you think that it's valuable?
a survey setting on this, like not.
Tell them where that's when they're young.
Even though it's like for a research basis, there's probably
Yeah.
Like going and say, like, this is effective, because we tried this. I don't know.
They're at higher risk of
Actually, the study is like, you're trying to and
so then we just say, well, that's a population
where you
and we're gonna have to say, well, yeah, that's like then we're also straight line.
Can we go back to the first?
How do you have that
Way
data?
of saying, explaining.
Yeah, and like,
It's not okay. You just have to.
these guys, yeah, I see.
Just need to do that.
and like how would you do that, like
That would still be for sure.
information to like identify risk.
No, at that point, you can't
Because then
conduct it, but-
you would like, you would either have to rely on like the clinicians who saw them at that time, and like, oh, they are like Caucasian, who like, do you think this like, or take a long time, or you like go back and are like, staff going to be like, oh, we like, oh, we like, now we find them to like,
Or she, I should, well, if
set
she-
up stuff that we have to do, right?
We can also do it on stages, right?
I think retrospective would be really part of this issue, because it's not like a, you have to, you know, it's not, like, that's more of a clear, just because
And we've also seen that
it's
also.
a lot more. But I would say like, it's not, like, I don't think you
to
can,
know.
like, if it was like, you can say, oh, this is their BMI, this is their this.
I'd say
I feel like you could, if part of the
Like you can't do just, like, you can't just get always one thing.
Right.
Sure, yeah, so I just don't know that it's like that.
Assuming it's
At the end of the day.
it's more
You're gonna go through all that. Is that?
Well, you asked, well, Josh, if you're like, that's her,
I would say,
as like a life patient.
Whole range.
Well, it does say that.
I like the idea of doing like a question, but like,
I see someone
you could
saying,
like,
let me do
as the
Withdraw,
clinician,
like hold
you could
it.
like contract this, like you could like
at a risk
try
that
and
maybe
involve some of
your
your colleagues
Yeah.
in
appropriate.
like coming to the study and like
Yeah.
in being involved in like coming up based on your clinical experience, like seeing, like helping like create the questions, but then like being not involved in administering or like registering.
Yeah. I think that makes sense to me too, and that's what I have come back in that. Really see this, that it should be years of doing that, like you can screen, you can figure out who would be good.
Even if your study didn't.
I don't know, like, I just think it is.
We're just gonna do it, like, you guys don't have to bring it all
Yeah.
Just like mix it separate.
Yeah, and then like how
We'll read the study and be like,
in theory just like a detailed questionnaire like, go through
Sending
all
away
that
for
stuff,
20
like, how do you like come up, because you can't take the person outside of the prison to like do
Yeah.
this, and like but if you like take them aside for an hour, like people are gonna notice that like
Yeah.
they're gone. So like, and if you're not doing the administering of the questionnaire, you would have to like arrange like a special time, but it'd be like taken from their like their other duties to like kind of do this. So like, which like it's an interesting like how to like how to protect the identity of these people.
And then I guess.
So then do you
Does get
create time for every, like,
I think you need to,
Create
because
that
you also,
hour.
one of your questions is frequency driving. So you would need to know about it as well. So you want the whole population, everyone to have
But I would yeah.
How often would you do it?
I don't know if you do it.
Well, because I just,
But that's like what people.
I guess it depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at like the rates of depression in the prison, or if you're looking at the difference.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Yeah.
Okay. You may not have figured it all out completely, but we only have 5 more minutes, so this is why the Research Ethics Board meetings are often 3 hours long. What do you guys think? So you guys with the tricky gene, what's going on?
So there are a couple of things that could explain this sort of one carrier, one non-carrier with a child who has the disease. And so in terms of, if we assume to start with that the mother and father are the parents of this child, that there could either be a de novo mutation or there's a different type of inheritance that's causing it. And then the second issue is that the father is not the father.